Welcome to the Science of Parenting podcast, where we connect you with research based information that fits your family. We'll talk about the realities of being a parent and how research can help guide our parenting decisions. I'm Mackenzie Johnson, parent of two littles with their own quirks, and I'm a parenting educator.
And I'm Suzanne Bartholomew. I'm an associate professor who strives to help people increase their financial security, and I'm the parent of a high schooler.
And here we are in our last episode of this season. Gone, like we said, it's like gone fast, but also we've been doing this a long time. Like it's both. But today we've been talking all season about kids and money, and today we're actually gonna like frame this whole conversation we've been having all season into like the context, right? So we're talking about kids and money, and we're talking about how we talk with them about financial capability and how we are socializing kids and all of these things. But we're going to talk about the context of really like the marketplace, right? So like how they make these decisions, where they're making them. They're doing this in the marketplace. I don't know. And so talking about consumption and how they can be good consumers and some of the challenges and opportunities we have, raising kids to be good consumers. But okay, but actually you were like, hey, hold on, not good consumers. So I'm breaking my own rule of like, we're not going to say parenting is good or bad. So not good consumers, right? You had other words. There were better words. Let's choose a better word. It wasn't good. It was
yeah, good was a little judgy, I felt.
Yeah, we're like not judgy. We're not going for that.
No. So we want them to be responsible, savvy,
Yes.
smart, discerning. I mean, there's a lot of words that we could use.
A lot of better ones.
Rational.
Oh,
rational is a tough one, but mostly and responsible. Did I say responsible? Did I start with that? Yeah.
Yes.
So you gotta be yeah.
Responsible feels like a good one. And that's, as I think about, each of us have our own values we're bringing to the table, of course, in this conversation that we've been having all season. But ultimately, we do want our kids to know how to succeed in whatever financial reality that is when they become adults. And so part of that is being responsible consumers. And so there's actually a few terms in this episode. I love a definition and a term, but one in particular is this idea of consumption. So Suzanne, can you define that for us?
Sure. Yeah. So we're talking about navigating the marketplace. We have income that we earn. So we have dollars that we have to spend. And so that is consumption. It's the use of a good or a service. And money is one way we get there. So we're all consumers, and we're always consuming day, night, the moment we're born till even our death, but there's decisions about our final burial and things. I mean, we're still consuming after we have died.
Okay. I gotta confess. When you first said, you're like, yeah, from birth, every day, every minute. I was like, nuh-uh. Like, I'm not consuming when, I was like fully prepared to like, not when I'm asleep. And then I was like, okay, but I guess like I'm consuming like the heating or air conditioning maybe in my home. I'm also utilizing like a mattress and bedding. I also, right, like, and white noise, like a fan, always the fan. I always have a fan on. Right. But it's like, I was prepared to be like, nuh-uh. And then I'm like, oh man, it is always, because sometimes it's material stuff, right? Like I'm using using a thing, but sometimes it is like you mentioned, like heating or like electricity or services, goods, products, all the time.
I know. We think about, like maybe you have to be at the store to be a consumer, that you're going out and you're getting food or you're buying clothing. But no, it's not just when we're spending.
No, like food, products, information. We're consumers of information, consumers of entertainment, of materials, of services. You literally saying like heating and electricity.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also mentioned like collectively we're consumers of what we want out of our government, like state or federal government services and products too. Like, right. That when we vote as consumers, we're consuming. Yeah.
Okay. So we are always consuming. And yeah, so even if my first instinct was nuh-uh, I'm like, okay, you sold. Like, yes. What I really thought about, I'm like, yeah. But I needed to get out of the mindset of consumption as only material things. like consumption as stuff, because it's not always just stuff, like you said, like services or um things like that. And
Yeah.
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 So I gave you the definition of consumption,
Mhm.
right? And so have been talking about financial well-being and how we don't make decisions in isolation and what we want to do
Mhm.
as parents, right? And so it is consumption and consuming is more complicated than just going to the store. It
Yes.
is, sometimes there are large purchases. There
Mhm.
are purchases from public utilities, like you mentioned, gas, water, heat.
Mhm.
Um, so we want our children to be able to navigate the marketplace, right? So that they
Yes.
understand, number one, like what influences their buying decisions and what forces are at work. We
Mhm.
want them to have a healthy relationship with goods and services that,
Yes.
our quality of life is dictated by goods and services. So the home we live
Mm.
in, the sheets that you're sleeping in, the clothes that you're
Yes.
wearing, whether or not you have electricity or water, which some
Yes.
families can struggle with having,
Mhm.
things shut off temporarily because they're behind on bills. So that's
Absolutely.
that's a piece of being a consumer. But to be a responsible consumer, and we've talked about financial abilities, but there are a
Mhm.
set of techniques and skills that go along with being a responsible consumer, and that's where we
Yes.
want to get our kids.
Yes, yes. And at the episode, we're gonna share some of those strategies and tips and techniques that we can get a little specific with. But I do like
Yeah.
this idea of thinking about consumption, you know? I'll be honest, when I think about consumption, it's easy for me to, like, villainize it. Like, "Consumption is bad, it's making me spend my money." Like, well, no. It's more than one thing, right? And so I think of consumption in terms of purchasing is one thing. You know, and it can be, like, if it's materialistic, there is this if I know I'm gonna purchase this, I'm gonna consume this thing, like a material good, there can be a like rush of dopamine, right? Like this hormone in our brain that is like, "Ooh, that felt good. That was exciting." And so it there can be this short-term feel good that happens with consumption. Or there's consumption, right, where like heating or air conditioning that I don't have dopamine because I forget I'm consuming it. Um, but there can be this short-term feel good. And so I do think as I think about specifically the term responsible consumption, that making sure it's really consumption that aligns with kind of our long-term goals, like financial goals and the values that we have and that aligns with hopefully financial well-being. So there is kind of
Mhm.
right, I in my brain wanted to like consumption is so bad, but okay, it's not all bad, it's not all evil, but understanding healthy consumption and intentional consumption as compared to maybe things that don't align with our goals, right? And you had another term, there's like another kind of other kinds of consumption, right? Besides the
Mm.
healthy, responsible, intentional.
Right, right. And before I jump into that,
Mhm.
just as there's dopamine, like there's spikes of joy or
Yes.
satisfaction that come with the purchase, purchases come with regrets too, which we haven't
Mm.
talked about. So
Yes.
that's something else we want to avoid is like buying something and
Mhm.
then a day or 2 later saying, "Oh, why did I spend my money on this?"
Yes,
Right? So,
absolutely.
yeah, so just to throw that out there, but so 2 terms that can help us understand, how overconsumption, can happen. One is conspicuous consumption, so
Mm.
that's defined as spending and consuming on a lavish scale. So,
Yes.
that's buying lots of clothing and automobiles, houses, if you can afford them, but, a lot of people can't afford them, and
Mhm.
to be able to be conspicuous, they maybe go into debt, right?
Yes. And
And
so
so
conspicuous if I can say it, conspicuous being like showing. It's consumption
right,
that's shown, right?
right, because you're driven
Mhm.
by how other people think about you, about their personal opinion of how like a
Mhm.
sort of image that you're trying to maybe put forth, being popular or being,
Yes.
a certain status. And so that's
Mhm.
where conspicuous consumption comes in. And as Americans, that is, we are less than 5% of the world's population, but we consume more than a third of the world's resources. And so we are a
Oh my
nation,
gosh.
that knows how to be consumers. Or, yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, and that idea of conspicuous, yeah, like showy consumption, consumption to show what we've consumed, right? And so, I
yeah,
mean,
and
my brain is like,
extravagant. Yeah.
yeah, my brain is like brand name materials and all of this stuff, but also, I'm like high-end purses, like high-end things is what my brain goes to. But that even happens within our kids, right? Like the kind of
Mhm.
snack we maybe bring for our child's field trip, right? The brand of
Mhm.
backpack, right? And so I think it's easy to think about it only in the extremes, but there is this conspicuous consumption we can do and model for our kids, whether we again intend to or whether it's just something that's kind of happening. So conspicuous consumption, and then what was the other one you had?
Oh, affluenza. So this
Mm,
is a play on the word affluent and influenza,
mhm.
and it's the keeping up disease, right? Which is
Yes.
also tied to that conspicuousness, but it's defined officially as a feeling of unfulfillment that results from efforts to keep up with the rest of society. And the thought is that there's this an epidemic of stress, overwork, waste, over indebtedness, which I talked about, that's
Mhm.
caused by consumers' pursuit of the American dream. So
Oh.
it might be that many parents struggle with this now affluenza in the sense of maybe they're feeling too much pressure to keep up with things and pressure to
Mhm.
have certain items, live in a certain house, drive a certain
Yes.
car, and that
Mhm.
creates the stress and sometimes over indebtedness. And again, we're talking about financial socialization this season, and that's what your kids are seeing.
Yes.
If you're, they see you stressed, they pick up on
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. And that we're modeling, again, intentionally or unintentionally, with our social, like we're socializing them to see we must do X, right? Like we must consume X, we must have
Hmm.
in order, but it results in this, right? It can result in that stress and um
Right.
and so there is more than one way, like there's pros and cons of that modeling that they're seeing, of course. And so I do think as we think about the term affluenza, one fun little play on words there, that like it's a disease, the affluenza, but also the showy or conspicuous consumption. Again, it does remind me, like going back to that, is this in alignment with our financial well-being and our values and our financial goals, or is this consumption not in alignment? And then yeah, is it conspicuous in those things like that? And so thinking about that idea of consumption, right? So the use of
Mhm.
a good or a service, but this is different. This is the other term that I was like, yeah, I thought that this was the same thing. Consumerism is another word. So similar, consumption, consumerism, both have like this idea of consume, but they mean different things. So can you tell us what consumerism is?
Yeah. So consumerism is a movement. And so, as consumers, individuals who interact with the economy or in the marketplace, we have challenges because there's this kind of healthy relationship with
Mhm.
healthy or sometimes tension with
Mhm.
manufacturers and sellers. And so the movement of consumerism was a result of needing to protect consumers who may be vulnerable or
Mm.
may be victims of bad actors like
Okay.
sellers or manufacturers who may be um, maybe grossly overstating the benefits of a
Mm.
product or maybe even being deceitful or fraudulent. So the official
Yes.
definition is that consumerism is a movement whose objective is to ensure that the consumer will pay a fair price for quality goods and services in the marketplace.
Mhm. And so that's actually like this is pretty hopeful, right? Like that there is a movement. And I mean, you've even said the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is a part of this movement, really, of like protecting consumers from like blatantly lying in advertising or having products, right? There's the what is it called? The Consumer Product Safety Commission, right? Like safe products and things like that. So kind of protecting consumers and making sure it's yeah, paying a fair price and things. That gives me
Yeah.
some hope. We love that.
Yeah. So, there's been a few waves of the consumer movement, but they really started early, like, well, in the late 1800s, when,
Mm.
like, with food labeling and food safety in particular,
Yes.
where manufacturers would throw things like metals and acorns and things like fillers into food
Mhm.
that people are unaware of. And
Yes.
so there was a real fight against Congress and indifferent consumers, like not knowing any better, not
Mhm.
responsible consumers, so that there had to be legislation. And so there's all sorts
Mhm.
of governing bodies around advertising, around product safety, around consumer protection. And you named it, like the
Yes.
Consumer Financial Protection Bureau uh,
Yes.
established in 2011, but
Mhm.
they have collected just on financial services and products like $15 billion.
Wow.
15 billion with a B
Yeah.
of remedies for consumers who were, you know, taken advantage of in some way by a company.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that idea of, consumerism, yeah, protecting consumers, but also this idea that there is like a healthy adversarial, like a healthy tension between producers and consumers, right? Like kind of needing each other, but also I don't want to say disliking, but like fighting each other a little. Right? Like there might be competing goals, but they can also be in alignment. But that this
Yeah.
relationship does exist. Like that this is there.
Well, let's face it, there's a ton of products out there that we love,
Mhm.
that are convenient, that we feel like we
Yes.
can't live without, right?
Yes.
And they came out of a need for most
Mhm.
likely. Otherwise, as consumers, we won't buy it if we don't want it, right?
Mhm.
And if we don't need it. And so yeah, there is a tension, but at the same time, I think we were talking about like Shark Tank. There's a lot of products that get that come into Shark Tank. There's like, that's a fantastic idea. And I it's somebody that wants to bring it to other people in need. It's not,
Yes.
and they want to make a living. I mean, it's when people are, or maybe companies are overly profit oriented, that we
Mm.
try that tension comes around
Yes,
potentially.
yes. Well, and I think that, as we again like come back to okay, think about raising responsible consumers. The reality is that we exist in this marketplace, but that our kids will, even if it's not exactly how it is now, when they become adults and they have their own income and maybe their own families and things, that we want to help them have the skills, the knowledge, the capabilities, and things to be able to succeed. Kind of, I mean, by whatever definition that is, that basically know how to do it responsibly, do it informed, like to consume in a responsible and again in alignment kind of way. That they're gonna need to know how to use their own money to meet their own needs. So again, consume.
Right, right. And so you want to teach them how can they use their income so that they get the most satisfaction. And
Yes.
so it's that piece that you're talking about where like there's well, I talked about regret of
Mm.
purchases, or just getting this temporary feeling of pleasure that
Mhm.
um that fades, helping them understand, that we're using our income to achieve our well-being. There are a lot of paths to well-being, and there's a lot of variability in terms of what families choose, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and then the other thing that I think about as I think about consumerism, consumption, and all of this is also like, okay, for some of us, like I talk about like my young kids, right? And how they also are consumers of like the heating and AC, but also the products and the food and the clothes and the stuff. Um, but they're unique consumers, right? Like our young consumers they're kind of specific. And what they're influenced by in particular, right?
Right. Yeah. So right now you're in control as a parent because you have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, right? And so you're bringing the goods and the services. We're talking like economists here. You're bringing
Yeah.
the goods and the services to your household, into your home. So
Mhm.
you're controlling that. But that at about age 6, the parental influence starts to decrease. It's still
Mhm.
there, obviously,
Mhm.
but we have friends start to influence, schools influence, churches or religious organizations, and then most importantly and strongly, advertising. So
Mhm.
after age 6, they start picking up on those other influences in terms of buying and thinking about
Yes.
consuming.
Yes, and I mean, yeah, this hits home. Like I've said, my daughter is 6, and I do really literally within, like, the last week or 2, I was kind of having this internal struggle, if you will, of my daughter was talking about it was, like, something on YouTube that she liked, and I was like, I don't love that." And typically, up to this point, because my kids have been younger, I've focused on like control of their consumption, right? Like, oh, I don't like that. I'm gonna increase the parental controls or change the rating or control the apps that are on the device we use or whatever. But I really kind of had to take pause and say, like, okay, but she's getting other influence, right? Like she's at the age now where I kind of use the word diluted, right? So like I might be still the main force of influence for my child's consumption, but as they get older, more things kind of come into the pot and dilute that I'm not the 100% influence anymore. And so I have been kind of having this struggle of like, okay, and so I've been kind of trying to shift my role, which we talk about in a different season, podcast season, but to like, okay, maybe control is not my role anymore. And as they get older, and maybe I do have to shift more to this like interpretation idea. We talk about our parenting stage when kids are school age being the interpretive stage. And okay, I'm not, instead of you can't or you won't do those things, it's maybe how am I going to talk with you about them or help you understand how they do or don't fit with our family values? Or um, it's tricky though. It's
It's
hard.
it's a balance, right? Providing
Yeah.
access, providing
Hmm.
control, and then providing independent thinking and choices.
Yes. Yes. And
So
yeah, I can't maintain the control I had over my 3-year-old when she was 3, right? And like my son who's 3, I won't have that for forever. That's not how it's
no.
gonna work. And so, but it is a new territory, maybe is what I want to say for us as parents that we're like, okay, we're gonna have to shift out of the well, I just won't let you watch that into well, you might watch it anyway. And so we have to kind of change our role is what our role
Mhm.
is. And I do think that is something that's kind of I think there are challenges we face like parenting today related to raising responsible consumers that maybe my parents didn't face and your parents didn't face. Some things stay the same, but some things have changed that mean that as parents these days, we have to maybe have more tools or more information or new ways of doing things. And so there's some unique challenges and opportunities as we think about raising responsible consumers. And so we really just kind of compiled like a little list here, and we're gonna spit them at you. So one is being advertising, just the prevalence of it. Like, it used to be before, smartphones really, you would see advertising like on a billboard or in a store or maybe like in a TV commercial. And it was explicit advertising, right? Like that is clearly an ad. And it was in whatever space, like it was either with the TV on or off, or it was like in the store or I'm not in the store. But now we carry advertising like in our pockets, right? In our smartphones, on the devices we let our kids use. And so that one, there's just more of it. But also digital advertising is often one of the articles you sent, Suzanne, talked about blurring, that it often blurs the line between entertainment and advertising. So I think of like influencers, right? Someone who's just talking about a product, but is it advertising or is it entertainment? Versus like also someone, I even think of like the YouTube videos with kids playing with toys. They often are making money off of when those toys sell. And so that blurring one, so prevalence of advertising and then the blurring that often happens for advertising, digital advertising, is those are concerns that previous generations of parents maybe didn't have to struggle with.
Right. Yeah, I think with the introduction of digital devices for sure,
Mhm.
there's so much more advertising embedded in games and like you're saying,
Yes.
YouTube. Yeah.
It's not
So
just at the store or when the TV is on. It's just here. It's just around all the time.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's changed is that kids have these devices that are their own. So,
Mhm.
previous generations used to be like one TV in in the family household. Now, it seems that there's, multiple televisions. Some kids have TVs in their bedroom, right? So
Mhm.
these single-use devices are now like tablets and cell phones. Um, that's one, those are more prevalent. And then it means that we're maybe not with our children when they're on the tablet or on their cell
Yes.
phone. So you're in the kitchen, or somewhere else in the house, your
Mhm.
child's in their bedroom, and you're not there really to monitor what content they're seeing. So that's, I
Mhm.
think, different as well. So we can't really talk to them then, right, about what they watched if they did see an advertisement or something
Yes.
that you would like to review with them.
Like the opportunity to overhear a TV commercial, right? Versus
Right.
a child with headphones on an iPad, right? Like we
Yeah.
don't overhear it and can't interact. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one thing. So those single-use devices more prevalent, and then also just more products in general, right? There's a greater
Mm.
variability, or not very, yeah, greater variability in like product lines and just more
Mhm.
products in general that have been created, whether we could use them or not.
Mhm.
Right. And so that means that it's just more difficult, I think, for us as consumers to make choices. We know that the research shows that more choices,
Yeah.
we can get paralyzed. And it's
Mhm.
also hard to discern what quality there is among products.
Yes.
So that's another challenge for consumers and parenting a responsible consumer.
Mhm. My in-laws have even talked about, like, when they were buying fridges, when they bought their fridge 25 years ago, they're like, "Now there's so many choices and features and just that difference, and that we are raising kids who are gonna need to know how to succeed within that, and how to consume responsibly within that reality of so much choice sometimes." Mhm.
Yeah. Yep.
Mhm. A few other things that are unique to or more relevant keep happening these days. One is more pathways to spending money, right? So it used to be like cash only, right? Like you
Hmm.
either had the coins and dollar bills or you did not. And now there's, I mean, I was going to say checks, but there are, but not as many. But even just like debit cards, credit cards, right? But even like cards that are linked to a device. Or I have a friend who has I mean, funny because it didn't turn out to be detrimental to their family, but their child purchased something via like their Alexa or Google Home. Right? And so there are these sometimes kids not realizing they're spending money. Like having my card linked to one of our devices like a tablet, and that money spending money happens that way. And so it's not always as clear. Um and there are pros and cons to that, right? Like reloadable allowance cards and things like that can be convenient, and sometimes there's challenges with it. Um, yeah.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the invisibility you're talking about of
Oh,
purchasing,
yes.
right? The abstractness of it, that they think it's natural, if you have a device in
Mhm.
your home that you can interact with and can buy things that,
Mhm.
that's natural to them. They don't make the connection that actually there is a cash or there is a financial transaction that's involved with
Yes.
interacting with that home device.
Mhm. Well, and that's also, that goes along with kind of the last one that I had here was like the increased access to purchasing, right? So not only there's more pathways and like you said, more products, like more choices, but also just the like shopping online, right? I don't have to go physically into a store to purchase. I can do this with my device that's in my pocket. Which there's pros and cons of that too, because some of the benefits also means increased access to purchase can also mean increased access to like helpful services, right? Like there's things I can do online, like online banking. Whew, that's made my life easier than if I needed to physically go into the bank every time.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Mhm.
mean, you bring up what we call fintech. So that's
Mm,
like a lot more products are available, whether it's like for savings products, investing products, banking, as you mentioned, budgeting,
yes.
that audiences who may have traditionally been like disenfranchised or
Mm,
maybe not comfortable going to a traditional financial institution, maybe not trusting a financial institution, now they can access different products through these technologies on their phone.
yes.
So I think that's a big plus.
Definitely. And so there are realities, I think sometimes people are like, "Oh, yeah, it's always the same." And it's like, "Well, there are certain things. Like why am I more focused on this than previous generations or things like that?" There are realities that we face and that our kids will face. And so we want to raise responsible consumers within this marketplace, like within this context.
Which
So,
may be more complicated than it used to be, let's put it that way.
yeah, that's a great way to kind of summarize all of that. Like there are
Mhm.
different things and that's okay. We just acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Yes. So then that kind of brings us back to this research, back to our research and reality, right? We're talking some of the reality, bringing it back to the research is like, why is this a big deal? Like, okay, Mackenzie, like, okay, Suzanne, you're telling us about consumption, you're telling us about this, all this stuff. What's the big deal? And ultimately, the research tells us there is impact of these things. One related to the amount of consumption, right?
Yeah, so like this, you mean materialism? Like
Yes.
over-consuming?
Mm-hmm.
What we're consuming. So if you think happiness is important, then
Then
that's
this matters.
then if you think happiness matters, then yeah. Um, so yeah, we see in the research that materialism is pretty consistently linked with our well-being. So if we're overly materialistic, We have a decrease in life satisfaction, in happiness, and in social cooperation, in
Mhm.
vitality. And then on the other side, greater rates of depression, anxiety, antisocial behavior, and racism has been
Mm.
shown to be affiliated with materialism. So that's
Mhm.
overconsumption, materialism,
Yes.
and again, financial socialization by parents leading to consumer values, attitudes, habits, norms.
All of it.
Yeah.
All of it. Well, and I feel like that really is kind of wrapping the full picture of the season, right? We talked about socialization and well-being and all of these things. And really what we see is when we can raise responsible consumers, right? Who do things in alignment with their values and their goals, as opposed to just consumption for the purpose of consumption, right? Or to be showy, or right, that idea of affluenza, of keeping up, that's harmful to them. Right? That like
Yeah. Yeah.
it hurts their well-being, which as parents we typically care about.
Right. Excuse me. Yeah.
Mhm,
So if we socialize our children to be more materialistic,
mhm,
excuse me, more driven by things like status, popularity, keeping up with other people, and
mhm.
worrying about the opinions of others, then that is going to be a lot more detrimental than if we have them focus on more intrinsic goals, things like
Yes.
they're more psychologically linked
Mm.
to well-being.
Yeah.
So giving back to the community, having social connectedness, experiences over products and services.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's one of the reasons it's like, what's the big deal? Well, it is linked to our well-being. And another thing you've heard us talk about this episode is advertising. And one of the reasons that we're talking about advertising, as it's linked to how and what and how much we consume. But the Federal Trade Commission talks about the concern about the amount of advertising that kids see and experience, because the reason it's a big deal for kids is because kids often cannot tell the difference between ads and just entertainment content like a show, right? Or,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, a game. And so according to research from the American Psychological Association, also widely known as the APA, research shows that kids under age 8 are prone to accept all advertising as truthful, accurate, and unbiased. So the reason it's a big deal that advertising is everywhere, if you will, and that our kids see a lot of ads, is because our kids are a vulnerable population to harmful advertising, right? That they do not cognitively, like in their brain, does not yet have the capacity to always be that discerning. And so one of the articles you sent talked about pester power of our kids, their ability to like ask and stick with it and ask and like, please, please, please. Oh, even just saying it repeatedly out loud. I'm like, I'm sorry, I just set off every parent listening. But that advertising can help drive that. And especially when our kids do not understand the purpose, right? Advertising is typically meant to drive consumption. So in our family, I've talked about this before, I think, we talk about the gimmies. And that's my like 3-year-old friendly way of, I'm not saying like, what that ad wants you to do? It wants you to buy stuff with the money that we make from our job, with our income, right? We don't go into all of it, but we talk about how sometimes a store might try to give us the gimmies by putting the candy right by where we are checking out in the grocery store. Or this ad on this game is trying to get me to get that game so that I can pay for it, so that they can, I consume the game. And so we talk sometimes about how advertising gives us the gimmies because my kids are 6 and 3.
I think that's a fantastic conversation to have, so that they can understand that, like, well, they're at the age where they cannot understand it. So they see their favorite character from a television show and it's linked to a product and they're like, oh, I must have this,
Mhm.
right?
String
They don't
cheese.
understand that they're being manipulated,
Yep.
and advertisers uh, get paid to sell, to help manufacturers sell products. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of ways to do that.
Right? My kids want the string cheese with a certain character, right? Like that's the string cheese that I want because I align with that character, not because I care particularly about string cheese, not because I've ever noticed there's a difference. Right? And so that's power. That is power
Yes.
that they have as these low consumers already.
Yeah, these characters are endorsing products for them.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Mm,
so that is a
it's
workaround for
tricky.
parents.
Yeah. Yes. I've also heard I think I've said this before, putting like branded stickers on like fruit, bringing stickers to the store to
Oh,
basically trick our kids into. I've
I
seen, like,
love
I
it.
saw that somewhere and it made me laugh. And I was like, that's kind of genius. I haven't done it myself, but I do think it's kind of genius.
Well, the thought did
Um,
cross my mind too, is like, do we do that with a lot of healthy food,
right?
where we have the link between the character? We need more of that.
Mm. Right? Nutrient dense foods, yes. But the good news is we're like, why is this concerning? Well, alongside the kind of concerns that we can have about the amount of advertising or about overconsumption, luckily there is good news. And Suzanne has actually some really specific strategies. Did I ask you earlier where we're pulling our strategies from? I know you had a good it was good stuff.
Oh, it's a simple consumer economics textbook.
Oh, awesome. We love this. So these are 10 strategies for raising responsible consumers. And so we're going to kind of like spitfire at you really quick, but just 10 things that you can do to help raise responsible consumers.
Yeah, and what that looks
Hmm.
like, right? So the
Hmm.
first thing is that a responsible consumer shouldn't assume things. So they should
Hmm.
always ask questions. That's something we've talked about, I think, in previous episodes. That problems arise as a consumer if you have a misunderstanding about what the features or expectations, what the contract is for a product or a good or service.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The next one, a responsible consumer gets agreements in writing. The verbal word doesn't necessarily hold up. So, if we're purchasing something or bartering, like even trading, right? Like, I'll give you this, you give me that. Having things in writing, responsible consumer, that's something they do.
Yeah. Number 3, research things ahead of time before you go shopping for a product or a service. So you're well informed, you know more, you'll be able to get a good deal, get the right product. Ways to go about that. You might ask friends. There's great consumer publications that have expert reviews that you could look at. There's great comparison shopping, programs in terms of looking at prices.
Hmm. Another one, talking about price, we want to consider the balance of price and quality when we're making purchases. So, cheaper is not always better, right? Sometimes we need to consider like the durability, right? If I buy something, yes, it's cheap, but maybe I'm going to need to buy 6 of them. And then it's actually more expensive because in that amount of time, maybe I would have only needed one that actually cost less. So, consider that balance of price and quality.
Okay, when it comes to using service providers, it's important to do a little investigation. It's that asking questions piece. Verify they're licensed if they're providing a particular service that requires that. Check if there's been any complaints against them, and get references, word of mouth.
Hmm. Right? And I'm like, childcare, electricians, those are all service providers.
Yes, they are. Yes.
Yes.
And do they have
Oh,
do they have their license? Are they bonded by an insurance company if something goes wrong?
mhm,
These are all things that you don't think about.
mhm. Good consumers do, or
Yeah.
responsible
Yep.
consumers do. Not good, not good. Oh, another thing for responsible consumers is not being bullied into buying something. Often into buying something right now. Right. So like that's a common sales tactic is like today only.
Mhm.
Because the reason it's a tactic is because it basically gets us out of our responsible consumer mindset of researching ahead and of making the decision that aligns with our values, right? So not getting bullied into quick decisions.
Right, and the next one is don't get fooled. Don't believe everything that you see and you hear, 'cause, if something seems too good to be true, it typically is.
Mhm. I've been fooled by that one. I've been fooled by a good ad or two. Can't believe everything we see or hear. So another thing responsible consumers do is know the policies for returns or exchanges. I actually recently made this error that I thought I could make it. I just assumed, oh, of course I could return this if it doesn't fit quite right. And then come to find out, actually, only I didn't know my policies. So, knowing
Oh,
about like returns and exchanges when you're purchasing something in case things go awry, because that's another thing a responsible consumer does. That's a part of it is what do I do after the purchase if I do have regret?
yeah. So I have to go on a tangent for a minute. So as a consumer, we're informed. That's one aspect of
Mm,
being a consumer, but then we're also rational. That's the other
mm,
part. And not even regardless of age, you can be
mm.
in your 50s and be irrational and uninformed. And so as
Yes.
a parent, you're modeling, your kids are picking up and observing. who you are as a consumer. You want
Mhm.
to be that informed and rational consumer that you're modeling for your
Yes.
child.
Yes.
So, yeah. So know your policies for returns and exchanges. And then the other one is to seek unbiased experts when you're making a purchase. And the
Mm.
example of buying a used car, if you're going to buy a used car, if you have a friend or you can pay a mechanic to come and check it out for you, you can avoid buying a lemon. So
Mhm.
seek out that unbiased expertise.
Absolutely. Well, and yeah, that can be in the form of actual people, but also now I even think of like consumer reports and like there are services, like
Oh, yeah.
places you can get unbiased information. Definitely. Okay. And then the final one I was not necessarily thinking about, but responsible consumers guard their personal information, right? So knowing to protect ourselves from identity theft, things like don't give out your social security number. But it protects us from fraud and exploitation and things like that. So that's another thing that responsible consumers do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And as all part of this is knowing when you talk about identity theft and you talked about the Federal Trade Commission, there are agencies, the first step for retribution or remedy when you're
Mm.
been wronged in the marketplace, you go back to the seller. And if that doesn't work, there's all sorts of great consumer protection agencies for you to go to so that they can do the time and the effort.
Mm.
Because it can be time consuming to make things right.
Oh, absolutely. So I loved these. Yeah, right. Straight from the textbook. I love when we are able to pull things straight from the textbook. So 10 strategies for helping being and raising responsible consumers. So
Yeah.
lots of good stuff here. We do have a minute to do our last. Are you prepared, Suzanne? Our last stop, breathe, talk space of the season, inviting our producer, Mackenzie DeYoung, in to ask us an off the cuff question.
All right. So, because it is the last episode of the season, my question for you is what, either personally or like for what you want to share with our listeners, what was your big aha of the season? What was your big, like, I know, Mackenzie, you often are like, oh, I'm
Like,
always
oh,
challenged when we have a season. I have these big ahas.
yes.
And maybe Suzanne, maybe you had a personal one too, or you just had something you want to share with listeners of like, this is the one thing that stands out in my mind.
I have one right away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one of mine is I'm doing way more financial socialization for my kids than I thought. In the first episode of the season, I was like, ugh, I have some room for improvement. And you're like, stop, stop. And I thought you were just being nice. And I'm like, oh no, like we are. And I mean, me individually, right? Like our family, but also as like our listeners and our viewers, chances are you're
Yeah.
doing more, whether intentionally or unintentionally, than you think. Again, we don't always give a lot of thought to this financial part of our lives, but obviously significant things that go along with it. So I would say like we're doing more than we think, and there's great opportunities to do it in like practical ways that really align with your values.
Mm-hmm.
That's
I
mine.
love it. Yeah, and I think I said in a previous episode, you don't give yourself enough credit because all the examples that you've used this season have been really impressive. That you
thanks.
do have so many conversations and examples that you provided. They're like, wow, you're doing it. So for me, when we were kind of contemplating implicit versus explicit financial socialization, so implicit being like the unspoken lessons versus the explicit socialization being those real purposive lessons. For me, just reflecting on my childhood and the imprint of my parents, implicit because they were not overt teachers of money management lessons, but just how that plays out in your adult life and your consumer behavior and your financial behaviors. I think is just so important for everybody to spend that time thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like, what am I doing today based on what my parents or guardian and my household taught me? It could be a grandparent, it could be aunt, uncle.
Yes.
But how is it playing out in today's real time?
Wow.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I say we had some impact on Suzanne, who knows a lot of stuff. I'm feeling good about it.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
We love it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for the last response to the last Brief Talk of the season. It's been great having you around, Suzanne.
Thank you,
Oh.
Mackenzie. You're an awesome producer
Well, thanks.
Oh,
and
thanks,
team member.
Ken. Oh, yeah, we're so glad to have her. Because that wraps it. There it is. Season 11, talking about kids and money. And I mean, yeah, today specifically in our episode, talking about consumption and strategies for raising responsible consumers. And I mean, the long-term impact that can happen from overconsumption or positive, right? Living in alignment with our financial, values and our family goals and things. But I mean, gosh, this whole season. I mean, I feel like, yes, Mackenzie's bow really, her question really ties it all in a bow of, we did, talk about financial socialization. We talked about the implicit and explicit. We talked about what influences how we use our money, right? And even just, I learned a lot of new terms like financial well-being and financial capability. And it was great to kind of break it down by age, right? That episode on kids, the episode on teens, and then some specific to emerging adults. But man, we covered a lot this season, Suzanne.
We did, yeah, and you did an amazing job organizing all the research and putting the episodes together, so you definitely get the credit. I appreciate you putting a focus on the topic, and it's money's at the it should not doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very simple, but it is part of our everyday life and practically everything we do, unfortunately.
Yes. Well, and thank you. Yes, I was organizing pieces that you brought to the table with your expertise. And so it's been great to collaborate and talk through. And honestly, for me, like I said at the beginning of the season, I don't always give this a lot of thought, this like financial parenting. And so it's been great to dig into that with you and hear your expertise and insight and share with our viewers. So thank you so much for joining us this season as our guest co-host. We've loved having you here chatting through all of this stuff. And so it's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Yes, it has been a lot of fun.
All right. Well, that's a wrap, I think. So, as always, thank you for joining us here on the Science of Parenting podcast today. And for listeners, remember that you can join us on social media, Facebook or Twitter at Science of Parent, and you can see our content in your feed and stay caught up with us between seasons.
So come along as we tackle ups and downs, the ins and outs, and the research and reality all around the science of parenting.
The Science of Parenting is hosted by Mackenzie Johnson, produced by Mackenzie DeYoung, with research and writing by Barbara Dunn Swanson. Send in questions and comments to parenting@iastate.edu and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or accommodation inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.